This file from August 2011 brings us to the remote wilderness of Yakima County, Washington, where a seasoned hunter's early morning scouting trip transformed into an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he knew about North America's apex predators. You're browsing the Cryptid Archives, narrative short stories based on real cryptid encounters, presented by Cryptids Across the Atlas. Daybreak in the High Country. Let me tell you about the morning I chose not to take the shot. As a hunter, that decision usually drives you crazy for weeks to come. That perfect moment lost to hesitation. But this time was different. This time, I'm glad I kept my hands still and simply watched, even though I had 3 different ways to document what I saw within arm's reach. The thing about hunting is that it changes you. Not just in the obvious ways, the early mornings, the patient waiting, the intimate knowledge of animal behavior, but in deeper, more fundamental ways. It reshapes how you see the world, how you move through it. After enough time in the wilderness, you develop what old-timers call a sixth sense, an ability to read the landscape like a book written in a language few people, remember anymore. I'd been hunting these mountains since I was old enough to carry a rifle. My father taught me in these same woods, showing me how to track a deer through pine needle beds, how to read the wind, how to become part of the landscape rather than just passing through it. The forest had a memory, he used to say. It remembers every footstep, every broken twig, every disturbance. Your job is to leave as little memory as possible. The Cowiche Wilderness had been my hunting ground for years. At 6,000 feet in elevation, it's a different world, where the air thins out and the forest keeps its own counsel. Most hunters come for the mule deer or elk, but I had my eye on bigger game that August morning. Bear season was open, and I had a tag burning a hole in my pocket. This particular area wasn't exactly a hot spot for black bears, but they were there if you knew where to look. I'd seen their signs over the years, torn up logs, claw marks on trees, the occasional track in muddy stream banks, but they were ghosts moving through the landscape like shadows, rarely seen, but most likely always present. 3 days before my encounter, I'd been setting up camp when a neighboring hunter approached my fire. He's an older guy, the kind who'd spent more time in these woods than out of them. And we got to talking, sharing the kind of information hunters usually keep to themselves. And that's when he mentioned the watering hole. "Few hundred yards northeast of here," he said, gesturing with his coffee cup. "Like Grand Central Station for wildlife. If you're out looking for a bear, that's where I'd set up." He paused, then something flickering across his face. "Been hearing some strange things up here lately, though. I want to bring your camera." I didn't think much of this warning at the time. Strange things in the woods usually had perfectly natural explanations, usually. Now, what he didn't mention, though, was that something else might be watching that clearing, too. The preparation for hunt is like a ritual. Every piece of gear was always checked and double-checked the night before. Camera equipment for documenting any kills. My new Nikon had already captured some impressive wildlife shots this season, if I do say so myself. My Remington 700 cleaned and ready. Sidearm, just in case. Even a comfortable chair for the long wait. In our line of sport, patience isn't just a virtue, it's a prerequisite. I'd also been paying attention to the weather patterns. August in the Cowiche Wilderness is a study in contrasts. Blazing hot days giving way to surprisingly cool nights. The temperature swings drive animal behavior, pushing them to water sources in the early morning and late evening. Understanding these patterns is the difference between success and going home empty-handed. Now, the night before my encounter, something had felt different about the woods. The usual evening chorus of birds had fallen silent earlier than normal. Even the coyotes, usually vocal after sunset, maintained an unusual quiet. At the time, I chalked it up to natural variation, maybe a mountain lion passing through, or just one of those random silences that sometimes fall over the forest. I should have paid a little more attention to that silence. I think it was trying to tell me something. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around me like a familiar blanket as I made my way to the clearing. Years of experience had taught me how to move through the woods without announcing my presence to every creature within earshot. About 80 yards from the watering hole, a grove of trees offered perfect cover for observation and, if necessary, a clean shot. The stars were still visible through the canopy as I settled into position. In the mountains, they seem closer somehow, as if the extra elevation brings you that much nearer to their old ancient light. The air had that peculiar pre-dawn quality, crisp and clean, carrying scents and sounds with remarkable clarity. What happened next taught me that sometimes nature has a way of testing not just your skills, but your entire understanding of what's possible. I'd barely settled into position when the mosquitoes found me, and not just a few. We're talking biblical plague numbers. Any hunter knows that movement is the enemy of success, but these bloodsuckers were relentless. The sound of my hand slapping at them might as well have been a brass band out announcing my presence to every animal in the county. That's when necessity birthed invention. I pulled my stocking cap down over my face, cut 2 quick holes for eyes, and zipped my jacket up over my neck. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And for the next 30 minutes, I became part of the landscape once again, another shadow among shadows as the eastern sky began to lighten. The clearing lay before me like a stage waiting for its actors. To my front, the watering hole, a natural depression that had likely been used by wildlife for generations. Beyond that, maybe 30 yards further, the opposite tree line where a massive game trail emerged from the forest. Every morning, this was where the show would begin. Deer, elk, maybe even, hopefully, a black bear, if luck was with me. In hunting, anticipation is everything. Each sound, each movement, it just draws your attention. A branch swaying in the breeze, a pine cone dropping to the forest floor. Your mind catalogs these disturbances automatically, separating the meaningful from the mundane. And after enough time, this becomes second nature. A constant background process running in your mind, kind of like when you go on autopilot driving to and from work. So the first hint of sunlight had just started painting the treetops when something moved into view. Not from the game trail I'd been watching, but from the left side of my field of vision. 110 yards away. I know this because, I checked the distance later on Google Earth. What stepped into view defied everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. It moved like a ghost. Deliberate but fluid, the way apex predators move when they know they have nothing to fear. The creature stood behind a fallen tree, giving me a full frontal view from the elbows up. And even at that distance, even in half light of dawn, the sheer scale of it was impossible to ignore. The rising sun caught its fur in a way I'll never forget. Each hair seemed to capture the light, creating a luminescent outline that separated it from the darker forest behind. While the exact color was hard to determine in that interplay of shadow and dawn light, the length and texture of that hair was unmistakable. Nothing like a bear's coarse fur or an elk's winter coat. It moved with the morning breeze, each strand catching the light differently, creating an almost ethereal effect. Its head and jawline cast shadows well below its shoulder line, a detail that would later help me calculate its true height. But in that moment, such analytical thoughts were far from my mind. Instead, I found myself repeating the same phrase over and over in my head. I'm looking at Bigfoot. I'm looking at Bigfoot. Time does strange things in moments like these. 45 seconds can feel like an eternity when you're watching something that shouldn't exist. My camera lay to my left side, my rifle and pistol on my right. 3 different ways to document this moment, to prove to the world what I was seeing, but something kept me still. Now, it wasn't fear, at least not the kind of fear you'd expect when encountering an unknown predator. This was something different. A recognition, perhaps, that I was being granted a privilege. That any movement, any attempt to capture or prove this moment might break whatever spell had allowed our paths to cross. The creature stood perfectly still, as if it was studying me just as intently as I studied it. There was something wise in its posture, a deliberate quality to its stillness that spoke of conscious thought. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for something of its size, it simply stepped behind a large tree and vanished. No crashing through the underbrush, no dramatic exit, just gone. Gone like morning mist burning off under a rising sun. I stayed in my position for another 2 hours, partly out of Hunter's discipline and, well, partly because I needed time to process what I'd witnessed. The forest seemed different now, as if the very air had changed around me. Every shadow held new possibility. Every movement caught my eye in a way it hadn't before. When 2 mule deer bucks finally appeared at the watering hole, I welcomed the return to normalcy. They were beautiful animals, the kind of bucks I would have been thrilled to photograph on any other morning. I even managed to get some photos of them, proof that my camera was working, that I hadn't somehow imagined having the means to document my earlier encounter. But those deer provided another piece of evidence I hadn't expected. As they approached the area where I'd seen the creature, their behavior changed dramatically. They stopped dead in their tracks, noses high, testing the air. The way they stomped their feet and kept looking between the spot and me spoke volumes. They sensed something was there, something that concerned them far more than my human presence. Their reaction was unlike anything I'd seen before, and I'd watched plenty of encounters between deer and predator. This wasn't the quick startle response you normally get from deer when they sense a mountain lion or a bear. This was very different. Like a deep, instinctive caution that seems to resonate with something ancient in their DNA. Later, I walked over to that fallen tree, the one the creature had stood behind. I'm 5'10", and the top of that log came all the way up to my shoulders, meaning whatever I'd seen, watching me from behind that natural barrier, had been massive. The ground was too covered in grass and pine needles to show tracks, but I didn't need any physical evidence. The memory was etched into my mind with a clarity no photograph could ever hope to match. A week earlier, my friend and I had heard strange growls around our campsite. Calls that seemed to triangulate our position from 3 different directions. 2 deeper voices and 1 higher pitched, almost feminine sound, creating a triangle of sound around our camp. We'd written it off at the time, filed it away as one of those unexplained wilderness experiences, but now, standing where this creature had stood, those memories took on a new significance. The vocalizations hadn't been random. They had been coordinated and strategic. The realization that these creatures might hunt or move in family groups, might employ tactics in communication, added another layer to my growing understanding of what shared these woods with us. After my encounter, I began researching other sightings in the area. The Yakima Valley and surrounding wilderness has a long history of similar reports, too many to dismiss easily. The local indigenous peoples had their own names for these creatures, their own understanding of what walked the high country. Early settlers had their stories too, though most were careful about who they shared them with. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't reach for my camera or my rifle. Some moments aren't meant to be captured or proven. They're meant to be experienced, to remind us that the world is bigger and more mysterious than we'd like to admit. That sometimes the best shot is the one you don't take. The encounter changed how I hunted. Now, I still carry my camera and weapons, but I'm more aware now of being watched. The forest doesn't feel more threatening. If anything, it feels more alive, more conscious. I pay more attention to those moments of unusual silence, to the way the other animals behave when something unseen moves through their world. The Cowiche Wilderness still draws hunters every season. I still go back, though I prepare a little different now. My gear still includes cameras and weapons, but my expectations have changed. I've learned that sometimes you go out looking for one kind of game, only to discover you're not necessarily at the top of the food chain. That morning taught me something else too, though, about the difference between being an observer and being observed. We hunters pride ourselves on the ability to read the world around us, to understand the movements and patterns of wildlife, but sometimes, when dawn breaks over places like Cowiche, you realize you're not the only one out there doing the watching. The high country is truly a wild place. In an age where it feels like every square inch of wilderness has been mapped, photographed, and analyzed, there are still things that defy our neat categories and careful explanations. Things that remind us that maybe we don't know as much as we think we do about what walks in these woods, in the spaces between our campfires and our trail cameras. Sometimes on early morning hunts, when the mist rises off the mountains and the sun hasn't quite cleared the eastern ridges, I find myself watching the shadows with new eyes, listening for that telling silence that might herald another encounter. Because once you've seen something that rewrites your understanding of what's possible, you never really see the wilderness the same way again. And sometimes, in those quiet moments before dawn, I wonder if somewhere out there in the vastness of the Cowiche Wilderness, something is watching back. Something that knows these mountains better than we ever will, that moves through them with grace and purpose we're only beginning to understand. This short story was based on an encounter originally documented by Oregon Bigfoot. Links to the original encounter, along with our other cryptid content, can be found below. And what do you make of the witness's decision to not photograph or otherwise document the encounter? While many would criticize this choice, could his hunting experience have led him to want to actually observe versus take a photo? Or is that a convenient excuse for something that may or may not have ever happened at all? Though the detail about the deer's behavior later is particularly interesting. How do you interpret their reaction to whatever lingering presence they detected? Would you have taken the photo, or would you have let the moment unfold and kept the mystery alive? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to hit that follow button. If you enjoy this encounter, please consider leaving an honest review. It helps other cryptid enthusiasts find these stories of the unexplained. And remember to keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see just on the edge of the road.